In this video, we're going to tell you the full story behind Marvel's very own day-walking vampire hunter, Blade, the beginning of the Blade. The life of the man who would one day be known as Blade was fraught with tribulations. Before he was the katana-wielding bane of vampires, Blade was just a boy named Eric Brooks. He was born in England in 1929. His dad, Lucas Cross, was one of those early 20th century weirdos who was a little too much into the occult. So much so that Lucas was part of a group called the Order of Tyranna, a secret society for, well, let's just say vampire fanboys. Eric's mom, on the other hand, was named Tara, and while baby Blade was still baking in her oven, Lucas made arrangements to send Tara to the UK, after which he became a prisoner in a Latvian prison. In England, Tara would change her name to Vanessa Brooks. But make no mistake though, she and her unborn baby weren't living like a couple of aristocrats during this time. She managed to get by, but mostly thanks to a woman named Madame Vanity. You see, Vanity was also a member of the Order of Tyranna, and she ended up taking in Vanessa at the time. And she happened to be the proprietor of a local house specializing in gentlemen's entertainment. So yeah, Vanessa might not have been staying at the Ritz, but it beat sleeping in the streets in early 20th century London. Eventually it came time for Vanessa to bring her baby into the world. Pregnancy wasn't easy. It called for the need of a specialized doctor, Dr. Deacon Frost. Hiring Frost turned out to be a big mistake because he himself was a vampire. Instead of guiding Vanessa during labor, the poor lady ended up becoming Deacon's latest meal. Now, Deacon's gross undead juices seeped into Vanessa's bloodstream and straight into her soon-to-be-born child. As a result, the baby's entire physiology transformed. Eric became a creature who was damned enough to carry vampire genes, but not so tainted that he became a bona fide vampire himself. In other words, Rick became a halfling, half vampire, half human. Vanessa unfortunately did not survive her encounter with Deacon Frost. But the silver lining here is that baby Rick got away with his life when Deacon was driven away before he could get his fangs on the infant. From there, Rick would be raised under Madame Vanity's roof. But make no mistake, the boy wasn't going to live a life of luxury. Rick's youth was spent troubled until he had a chance encounter with Jamal Afari, who happened to be a professional vampire slayer from the United States of America. Eventually, Jamal learned of Rick's status as a half vampire, which prompted him to take the boy under his wing. As such, Jamal would basically become Rick's father figure, teaching him everything he knows about vampire hunting. You see, Rick only had one mission growing up now: to avenge his late mother's demise at the hands of Deacon. And well, let's just say Rick was more than determined to do this, as he didn't only put Deacon in his crosshairs, but each and every vampire that might get in his way. Given that, Rick assumed the role of a vampire slayer by the time he reached his teens. Inspired by the profession's tools of the trade, Rick came up with his alter ego, Blade. On a sad note, Rick and Jamal were forced to go their separate ways when Rick accidentally took out someone who he mistakenly thought was a vampire. This prompted Jamal to save his protege by taking the heat for the crime, sending him behind bars. Blade would work as a one-man vampire hunting operation afterwards, thankful for his freedom. But in 1943, he teamed up with the likes of the Soldier Supreme, War Thing, and a tank crew of spirits of vengeance called the Ghost Riders to form the Secret Invaders, a mystical-themed World War II era team dedicated to battling the Axis powers' occult agents. In the Secret Invaders, Blade would play a part in defeating the vampire Luftwaffe, which is as weird as it sounds. He'd also destroy a demonic German U-boat, and the U-boat was possessed by the Dark Lord Mephisto. After the Allies promptly kicked the Axis powers' butts, Blade returned to working as a solo vampire hunter for a couple more decades. However, by the time of the late 60s, he would meet a group of fellow Fang hunters and form their own vampire hunting team. This collective, made up of Blade, Ogun, Azu, Oji, and Masenda, had one goal: to beat the poster child of all vampires in the Marvel Universe, the one and only Count Dracula. To do this, Blade decided to finesse their way into Dracula's dwelling by pitching a supposed partnership with the vampire. Blade enticed Dracula to hire his team's services under the guise that they'd help him conquer the world. Blade even went so far as to guarantee Dracula that the vampires would rule the world in a decade if he started to partner up with his team. Not one to turn a good deal down, Dracula agreed to Blade's proposal and invited the rest of his team for a meetup. But as it turned out, their plan all along was to ambush Dracula. It worked too, as Blade and his fellow vampire hunters managed to take down the Count during their fight. But still, it wasn't enough. Although they managed to win the battle, Dracula's trusted thralls and servants managed to bring him back. Dracula then took revenge against his attackers and managed to take out nearly each and every member of Blade's vampire slaying group. By the end of it, only Blade himself and Musenda were the ones left standing. Blade would then find himself in New York just a few years later in 1972. He was investigating the recent murder of a certain creature that resembled a bat. During this period, he'd meet heroes like Kalu, James Lucas, Adam Brashear, Constance Molina, and the Bear to eventually form a group called the Mighty Avengers. Their main adversary was a group that called itself the Deathwalkers. Now, the Deathwalkers wanted nothing less than the extinction of humanity, and Blade ultimately discovered that they were planning on using the bat-like creature as a sacrifice to fulfill this plan. Long story short, the Mighty Avengers confronted the Deathwalkers, and as you'd expect, a classic superhero v supervillain fight happened, with Blade and the Mighty Avengers coming out on top. Blade vs. Dracula 2. Blade returned to London, where he split his time between working as a vampire slayer and a jazz trumpeter, because hey, smacking vampires around isn't enough to pay the bills. In any case, Blade was living a relatively chill existence during this time. He even started a relationship with a woman named Saffron. But as far as superhero stories go, peace is just a prelude for more action. Blade coordinated with other vampire hunters, mainly a group of slayers headed by a man named Quincy Harker. Quincy's team included other formidable professional fang killers like Frank Drake and Rachel Van Helsing. Blade's partnership with these guys was fruitful to say the least. This all-star team of vampire slayers hounded Dracula left and right. Even better, it all culminated with their group absolutely dunking on the Count with, you guessed it, a good old-fashioned stake in the heart. Simply put, it was 2-0 for this Blade vs. Dracula rivalry. But as before, you can always trust the Count's pesky underlings to do their thing and bring their master back to the land of the living, and this time Dracula managed to get one over Blade when they fought. Dracula's W during this fight was almost definitive too, as he managed to overpower the vampire slayer, suck on his blood a little bit, and ultimately leave Blade for dead. Eventually, Quincy tracked down Blade's near lifeless body. A fight between the two Fang killers almost happened when Quincy thought Blade had been turned into a full-fledged vampire. But everything was fine after Blade explained his status as a half-vampire to Quincy. In fact, Quincy even tried to convince Blade to formally become a part of his team so that they could put Dracula down for good. However, Blade refused the offer because remember, our guy had one primary goal: to find and take out the specific vampire who killed his mother, Deacon Frost. But in spite of all this, Blade would soon find out that his rivalry with the Count was far from over. Simply put, it seemed that Dracula's recent W over Blade got him an overabundance of confidence, so much so that he sicked one of his vamp minions to try and attack Saffron. Blade managed to rescue his girlfriend and eventually caught wind of what the Count was trying to do. Since he was not the kind of guy to just sit around, Blake took it upon himself to hunt down his nemesis once again and fight him. As for Dracula, well, let's just say the man bit off a little bit more than he could chew. That's because it didn't take long for Blade to catch him outside of the streets of London, after which he got his butt handed to him yet again, as Dracula ended up tucking his cape between his legs after their fight. That's 3-1 in favor of our favorite vampire hunter. In Blade's next adventure, he found himself in Boston, hot on the heels of Deacon Frost. His quest was interrupted when Dracula appeared without invitation and asked for Blade's help in explaining himself to Quincy. You see, a series of vampire-related murders had been going on in the city, and we find out that Dracula has lost control of his own vampire coven during this time with a guy named Dr. Sun. Dr. Sun was such a problem that he was almost able to take out Count Dracula himself. But this didn't happen only because Blade decided to jump in and help the disgraced vampire leader. Afterwards, Dracula proved just how much of a sleazebag he is by refusing to return the favor when Blade asked him to help him find Deacon. And while another fight happened between the two, and suffice it to say that their record stood at 4-1 in favor of Blade right after this one. In a 7-game series, Dracula lost in 5. The hunt for Deacon Frost. Blade got back to his search for the dastardly Deacon Frost, and it was here where he met Hannibal King, a vamp who, unlike most of his kin, wasn't a scummy villain in the Marvel Universe. As is tradition with first meetings in superhero comics though, Blade and Hannibal got into it when they encountered each other for the first time. But as far as these stories go, the two ended up patching things up when they discovered that they were both on the hunt for Deacon Frost. On a side note, Hannibal did give Blade a solid humbling during their fight. Regardless, both Blade and Hannibal formed an alliance to get their mutual enemy. Along the way, they found out about one of Deacon's plots, that he created a Blade doppelganger, although for what purpose exactly, the two didn't know at the time. As for Blade's girlfriend, Saffron, the two were still romantically involved during this time. Saffron even moved from London to Boston to be close to Blade, but romance had to wait, as Hannibal and Blade eventually discovered Deacon's plans for his doppelganger. To be specific, the villainous vampire was planning on using the Blade clone to take out the original. Weirdly enough, Blade and his copy ended up fusing with each other when they attempted to put hands on each other. Ultimately, this fusion resulted in the doppelganger taking control of Blade's body. Now, this fused Blade clone has its sights set on Hannibal, and Hannibal came out on top. The fight between the two allowed Hannibal to locate Deacon, who at the time was partying with Dracula. Noticing the party crashers, the Count got all aggro and took it upon himself to bring down Blade's doppelganger. It worked, as Dracula managed to defeat the clone, all the while talking trash about how the guy was a fake, because the OG Blade would have kicked Dracula's butt every which way. In the end, Hannibal did the OG Blade a solid when he approached the mystical hero Damon Hellstrom to exorcise the doppelganger from his body. The procedure was a success, and both Blade and Hannibal continued their hunt for the elusive Deacon Frost. Finally, their search was successful when they managed to locate Deacon. Not only that, but Blade finally got retribution for what he did to his mom way back when Hannibal and himself took out Deacon. Blade stalks the night. Not long after defeating Deacon, Blade found himself in another fight with his nemesis Dracula. This eventually led to Blade getting admitted to a psychiatric facility, a bit of a long story there. However, his stay inside here was cut short when none other than the Sorcerer Supreme himself, Dr. Strange, made arrangements to get Blade an early release. But make no mistake, Strange didn't do this out of the kindness of his heart. That's because the Sorcerer Supreme was hankering to build a new superhero team called the Nightstalkers, along with Hannibal and Frank Drake. And it suffices to say that they needed a top prospect like Blade to get on with this adventure. As the Nightstalkers, one of their first missions was to take out a couple of targets, Johnny Blaze, who happened to be the former host of the Spirit of Vengeance, and Danny Ketch, the current Ghost Rider at the time. As you'd expect, a fight happened between the two factions, and it all worked out though in the end when Blade and his team realized that the client who ordered this, Lilith, had been playing them all along. And for your info, Lilith happens to be the so-called mother of all demons in the Marvel Universe, or at least one of them. On top of all that, both Johnny and Danny joined up with Blade's team, after which they put Lilith in her place. From there, their team would also evolve to form another group called the Midnight Suns, which was a collective focused on dealing with threats from the Marvel's various dark, mystical corners. Now, the Midnight Suns was a large team. Not only did it have the heroes we've just mentioned, but their ranks grew to include the likes of Morbius and the Darkhold Redeemers. One of their notable victories included throwing down with Lilith yet again, with the Midnight Suns achieving a resounding victory. On a sadder note, it was also during this period that Blade's relationship with Saffron started to get stale. And well, the the two broke up in the end. During the Midnight Massacre storyline, Blade got in way over his head when he used the powerful mystical artifact, the Darkhold. He even started calling himself by the name Switchblade and started going on a tear against any and all supernatural creatures he could get his hands on. But the status quo eventually went back to normal when Blade snapped out of it and things pretty much reset. Eventually, Marvel's vampiric race re-emerged in their universe, which prompted Blade and his fellow Nightstalkers to do what they do best: take down vampires. This led them to fight against Varna, who was the first ever vampire to exist. Unlike Dracula, Varna wasn't just some jerk with all sizzle and no steak. In fact, Varna was such a unit that he was able to take out Hannibal and Frank during their fight. This just ended up making Blade all the more determined to bring down the so-called first vampire, which he did. And shortly after that, we discover that Hannibal was able to survive, and he and Blade continued their partnership. Sometime later, the Nightstalkers disbanded and Blade decided to move from Boston to Greenwich Village. It was during this time that we find out that he and Saffron had a child, a daughter by the name of Brielle. Blade would later catch wind that Deacon Frost had re-emerged and partnered up with the mystic Marie Laveau with the goal of taking over the New Orleans Mafia and bringing Varna back to life. In turn, Blade teamed up with the psychic hero Bible John to hunt down the two villains. This particular chapter in Blade's life saw him becoming hostage to Deacon Frost at one point, along with his allies Hannibal and Brother Voodoo. However, our heroes managed to escape again, and as you'd expect, Blade and Deacon had another heated encounter. This fight ended up in a draw, as Deacon managed to tuck tail and run before Blade could drive a wooden stake through his chest. Not long after, Blade teamed up with the one and only web slinger of Marvel Universe, Spider-Man. The two heroes had to face off against Morbius, who at the time was under the thrall of a vamp only known as the Hunger. This encounter led to Morbius taking a bite out of Blade, which resulted in the legendary vampire hunter's physiology going through another change. Where he was once a half vampire, Blade now became a bona fide Daywalker. That is to say, he became a fully fledged vampire, except he was immune to the sun's rays and also didn't have the usual vampire's weaknesses. Pretty cool, right? Well, not really, because becoming a Daywalker also made Blade go a little crazy for that red juice. In fact, the only thing holding back his base desires during this time was a serum that could suppress his vampiric urges. Still, Blade kept on doing his thing in spite of these hangups, and as a matter of fact, he was able to dismantle a secret vampire society who planned on turning the US's entire coast into a haven for vampires. At some point, Blade became a S.H.I.E.L.D. prisoner thanks to the shady dealings of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s own anti-vampire unit, and a long story short, Blade was able to free himself and eventually shake Silvereye off his tail. Slaying in the night. Eventually, Blade would come face to face with a race of creatures called the Trex. Now, the Trex had a thing for taking out vampires in spite of the fact that they themselves were technically part of the vampire race. And since their objectives more or less aligned, the so-called queen of the Trex, Celia, made arrangements to basically bring Blade into their fold and make him the Trek King. However, a wrench was thrown in their plans when a group known as the Seven emerged. The Seven was this ancient secret society of hunters dedicated to bringing vampiric equilibrium to the Marvel Universe. Simply put, the Seven took it upon themselves to make sure that the population of vampires and other supernatural beings in their world were thinned down just enough to allow them to coexist with humans. And you'd think that being in more or less the same profession as Blade would make the Seven allies to our favorite vampire slayer. But no, that's because the Seven thought that Blade was sort of a maniac for taking out any vampire that he could find. In other words, Blade was ruining the vampiric equilibrium. So the Seven put out a hit order on Blade. And in the meantime, Blade started dating a woman called Susan. Along the way, the Seven was able to manipulate Blade into taking out scores upon scores of Trex, promising him that he could transform into a bona fide human if Blade managed to take a plunge in Celia's bath. Blade also discovered that Susan was actually Celia in disguise. In any case, Blade still went on a tear through the Trex hideout, but Celia was able to escape the vampire hunter's wrath. And here's when we discover that Celia was pregnant with Blade's child. Now the Seven, through all of this, realized that there was nothing they could do about Blade, so they were simply forced to retract their hit order on him in the end. Blade would have an outing with none other than Frank Castle, aka the Punisher. This happened when the two crossed paths after each of them were tracked down by a bunch of thugs and vampires who were having a shady street deal. And if you're wondering, of course the Punisher and Blade ended up laying waste to them. At this point, you probably already noticed that Dracula was much less of a threat than he was a regular nuisance for Blade. That holds no less true when the legendary vampire hunter then dunked on the Count yet again while they were aboard a S.H.I.E.L.D. helicarrier. After that, Blade went on a time-hopping adventure where he came across his dad, Lucas Cross. And unknown to Blade, he had particularly fulfilled a certain prophecy when he helped Lucas escape incarceration in Latveria. This is where we also find out that it was Lucas who played a hand in Count Dracula's initial emergence. And while Lucas is what you call a little bit of a disappointment in a dad, not only was he not around during Blade's youth, but he also had the audacity to force his own son into fulfilling his prophecy, which stated that Blade had to feed on the blood of a virgin. But this fell flat, as Blade was able to escape with the girl he was supposed to bite. From there, Blade decided to go back to the UK and dig deeper into his roots and this whole deal with the prophecy. Along the way, Blade would come across Draconis, a powerful vampire who was, well, out for Blade's blood. As it turns out, Draconis was around even way back when Blade was still a fledgling vampire slayer. Blade's crusade against vampire kind prompted Draconis to make it his mission to put the legendary vampire hunter 6 feet under. Everything went according to plan when they met, as Draconis managed to overpower Blade. Now, the only reason why Blade survived is because he had something that allowed any vampire who had it become temporarily immortal. In any case, Blade did the smart thing. He called up his old friend Hannibal King, and they worked together to take out Draconis. But here's the catch, though. As we discover, Blade had fulfilled another part of his dad's prophecy during this fight, as Blade ended up feeding on Draconis' blood in order to sap the guy's strength. We soon find out that Draconis was a virgin, which is in line with the prophecy that foretold Blade would feed on a virgin's blood. Afterwards, Blade would uncover a series of big revelations. For one, he found out his mom Tara was also part of Lucas's occult society, the Order of Tyranna. In addition, Blade was also made aware that the Order of Tyranna had a connection with another mystical themed group, the Knights of the Pendragon. Blade's search for answers eventually led him back to the US, where he found Lucas somewhere in Washington. Here, another big reveal came in the form of Blade finding out that his dad was also a vampire. On the bright side, Blade and Hannibal were able to secure a copy of Lucas's prophecy, which allowed the legendary vampire hunter to learn that he had actually been doing everything that the prophecy said this whole time. So Blade took it upon himself to avert the prophecy. This then led him to look for his old mentor and father figure, Jamal Afari. And guess what, guys? It turns out that Jamal was also a vampire this whole time. In any case, Blade and Hannibal looked for Jamal to no avail. Eventually, Lucas approached them and offered to help them in their search. Lucas just further proved how much of a sleazebag he actually was when he revealed that he'd been keeping Jamal hostage this whole time. From there, Lucas started using Jamal as leverage, his life, in exchange for Blade's cooperation in fulfilling this stupid prophecy. Now, if you're wondering what this prophecy was actually all about, we soon discovered that Lucas had been trying to restore each and every vampire's soul back to their respective bodies. It sounds like a pretty well-meaning act, but Blade knew that doing this could turn vampires into an indestructible, unbeatable force, so he refused to go along with it. This caused Hannibal to betray his old friend, since Hannibal himself had previously been turned into a vampire and wanted nothing more to get his old soul back. That is to say, Hannibal tried to take down Blade. The hits just kept on coming, as Blade then had to face Dracula after this. The Count, like Lucas and Hannibal, wanted Blade to fulfill this prophecy, but Blade refused once again. Another typical bout between Blade and Dracula happened, and in the middle of it, Blade inadvertently fulfilled the last leg of his prophecy, but it didn't turn out as Dracula or Lucas had imagined. That's because instead of returning the soul to each and every vampire back to their body, the prophecy ended up just resurrecting vampires vampires that had already fallen. In the end, Blade decided to spare his dad's life, not out of some sort of family duty, but to force Lucas to become a first-hand witness to the mess that he created. On the other hand, Blade and Hannibal patched things up when he handed his friend a serum that allowed Hannibal to suppress his bloodlust and act more or less human, giving him a little bit of peace. Blade's team-ups. Not long after that whole mess with the Lucas prophecy, Blade found himself joining a Wetworks team called the Vanguard. Now, we won't go into too much detail about this, but all you need to know is that for the most of Vanguard's members, they had a habit of screwing each other over for the sake of maintaining their secrecy. Thankfully, this team was short-lived, as they were ultimately forced to go their own ways after this whole debacle with its top agent Trenton Kraft, aka Colonel America. Blade's next team wasn't as bad, as they became part of the UK's MI-13, aiding in the war against the shape-shifting Skrulls. During this storyline, where vampires and Marvel's Children of the Atom came into direct conflict, Blade sided with the mutants to help bring down Xeris. Now, Xeris was the son of Dracula, and well, even Dracula himself hated this kid, so much so that the Count also decided to ally himself with the X-Men during the saga. By the end of the storyline, Dracula had literally ripped Xeris' head off, but the story didn't end there. You see, Blade was more than eager to throw down with his age-old enemy once more. However, Cyclops acted like the Boy Scout that he was and instead prevented further hostilities between the two from erupting. Dracula then left the scene while Blade effectively ended his temporary partnership with the Children of the Atom. Blade's next adventure was more tongue-in-cheek, as he had to disguise himself in a Spidey-inspired costume and take on the codename Spider Hero in order to keep his existence secret from the rest of the superhero community. It worked out great, as Blade ended up joining a new team of superheroes who dubbed itself as the Mighty Avengers. Shortly after, Blade tried on a new shtick when he took over Clint Barton's old Ronin mantle. Eventually, Blade's old adversaries, the Deathwalkers, discovered that he was the guy under the Ronin costume, so they started hunting him down. You see, the Deathwalkers were at it again with their whole bonkers plan of eliminating all humankind from the planet. To do this, they planned on using Blade as a catalyst to give birth to a creature known as the Deathwalker Prime. This ultimately blew up in the Deathwalkers' faces when the Mighty Avengers came to the scene, not only to save Blade, but to use their own magical doodads to help themselves transform into a creature called Avenger Prime. In the end, Avenger Prime defeated Deathwalker Prime, and the occult was promptly taken down shortly after. Now, Blade's team-ups would get a bit of an upgrade when he started working with the main Avengers team at the time. As part of Earth's mightiest heroes, Blade was instrumental in preventing a vampiric civil war from happening between the Shadow Colonel and a group called the Legion of the Unliving. On a side note, this whole civil war was actually just a ruse that Dracula kickstarted to pretty much weed out the weaklings in Marvel's vampiric communities. For a time, Blade was a key member of the Avengers, and his tenure with the team culminated in Null's attempted invasion on Earth. For those that don't know, Null is basically the creator of the symbiote race in the Marvel U. Now, during this attempted takeover of Earth, the vampire race decided to form a temporary alliance with Earth's remaining heroes in fending off Null and his forces. Earth ultimately won that war, which then led to the United Nations granting the vampire race their own sovereign territory located in Russia's Chernobyl exclusion zone. In turn, Blade took it upon himself to stay in this newfound vampire nation to keep an eye on the vampires in case they do anything that could jeopardize the rest of the world. So with the blessing of both the Avengers and the UN, Blade left his seat in Marvel's premier superhero team and made his way to the new vampire nation. Then came a time when Blade awakened to a version of the world that had been historically altered in major ways. Particularly, he learned that the Earth's mightiest heroes, the Avengers, never existed in this reality. Instead, it was the Squadron Supreme that stood as the world's superhero team. Of course, Blade was having none of this, so he took it upon himself to restore the original timeline. First, he approached Thor for a team-up, but no dice. On the bright side, Blade was able to locate Steve Rogers, who was at the time still trapped in a block of ice. And guess what? Cap was not one to turn down a bit of heroics, so he agreed to join Blade in his quest. From there, Blade and Cap were able to gather more heroes in their ranks, such as Echo and Black Panther. Plus, Echo was successfully brought Thor into the fold after he regained his memories. All the while, Squadron Supreme was able to catch wind of what Blade and his crew were doing, so they decided to keep an eye on them. Eventually, the reformed Avengers and Squadron Supreme came across each other and another big superhero on superhero fight happened. Although it's a bit anticlimactic, this battle ended when the original timeline was restored after an artifact called the Pandemonium Cube did its thing. Just like that, Blade was back on his post in the Chernobyl exclusion zone on Earth 616. Blade becomes a beast. Blade's next adventure saw him coming to blows with a literal god. It all started with the legendary vampire slayer accepting a job in protecting a girl from an assassin named Raven. Of course, this was a pretty easy job for Blade as he immediately did away with the girl's assailant. But the twist came when Blade discovered that the same young woman he was tasked with protecting was actually Adonna, who happened to be a dark old god. Even more, Blade soon found out that the assassin he had just taken out was trying to defeat this evil god using his mystical sword. Our guy had been made a fool, and naturally Blade tried to correct this mistake by trying to defeat Adonna. But a Daywalker like him was no match for a god, so Blade got his lights knocked out of him for 13 days to boot. When Blade woke up, he found himself hostage to the same occult that the assassin he eliminated comes from. Absolutely furious that Blade pretty much kickstarted the end of all times by preventing their agent from destroying Adonna, they had their way with the Blade. Eventually, one of the cult's members, a girl named Rotha, decided ragging on Blade was going to lead them nowhere. So she cut her ties with them and freed the vampire slayer. From there, the two teamed up to hunt down Adonna and effectively stop the apocalypse from happening. In the meantime, Adonna was wreaking havoc. She started by taking out any potential threats to her goals, by which we mean she dispatched numerous mystics in the Marvel Universe. While this was happening, Blade and Rotha traveled to Japan to meet with Tamlin Hamato, aka Tulip. You see, Tulip was an old flame of Blade, who happens to be a black market arms dealer specializing in mystical weapons. Tulip eventually revealed that one of the only accessible weapons Blade could use to take down Adonna was Lightbringer, the fallen angel Lucifer's fabled sword. The problem was that Lightbringer was currently in the possession of Hamilton Achilles, a vamp arms dealer. Hamilton had stashed the legendary sword away aboard a train made of adamantium. This train was one insidious vehicle because Hamilton was using it to store a huge amount of food supply. In other words, people. Of course, Blade and Rotha leapt into action after about learning this, and Tulip was in on it too. Plus, Doctor Strange even joined them, considering that he knew how much of a problem Adonna was. The mystics Adonna took out were part of Doctor Strange's network, so there was a bit of a payback for him to be had. Not long after, Blade and his team raided Hamilton's train. A fight happened between Blade and Hamilton over Lightbringer, and curiously enough, Adonna did Blade a solid by putting Hamilton under her thrall, forcing him to give Lightbringer to Blade, and then having the vampire arms dealer snuff himself out. But then we immediately find out that this was Adonna's plan all along. She knew that Blade was going to come for her with Lightbringer in hand, and that's exactly what she wanted to conduct the next phase of her plan. Adonna was able to unleash the so-called primordial wave that transformed people from all over the globe into grotesque horrors. And just to add insult to injury, Adonna fused Tulip's soul with a demon just to show Blade what happens when you mess with her. And well, this honestly super effective in throwing a vampire slayer off his game. Racked by guilt and rage from everything that had recently happened, Blade went all gung-ho and decided to throw hands with Adonna once more. It worked out as you'd expect, with Blade getting his half-vampire butt handed to him. On top of that, we learned that Adonna had successfully created an entirely new version of Hell, one she crafted to rule by herself. By the end of their fight, Adonna yeeted and defended Blade out of her domain, sparing his life just so he could live knowing how bad he got beat. Not wanting to cause his allies any more pain, Blade decided to leave Tulip and Rotha under the care of Doctor Strange. But make no mistake, there's no quitting for this legendary vampire hunter. He knew that Adonna was just too much for him, so he came to a decision that he never once thought he'd make. Ask his longtime nemesis and occasional frenemy, Count Dracula, to become his very own Mr. Miyagi. Simply put, Dracula was going to teach Blade how to unleash his true potential as a vampire, which would hopefully be enough to defeat Adonna. In true vampire Karate Kid fashion, session, Dracula and Blade had themselves a few rounds of sparring. A brief assessment later, and Dracula revealed the true reason for Blade's problems. As Dracula put it, Blade had to embrace his vampiric heritage to bring him to the next level. In the end, Blade heeded the Count's advice. Not only that, but Dracula did our guy a solid by letting Blade drink a bit of his own blood. This then effectively transformed Blade from a Daywalker to a Strigoi, a high-level vampire on the same level as Dracula himself. Shortly after, Blade took a quick detour to help Bruce Banner in helping him exorcise a demon from a kid somewhere out in the middle of nowhere. With that matter resolved, it was back to his main quest. So Blade approached the mystic hero Satan Hellstorm to bring him to the next phase of his plan, traveling to OG Hell and recruiting an army of damned souls to help fight against Adonna and her forces. This almost blew up in Blade's face when one of the Hell's Desians, Abrath the Collector, tried to take out the vampire hunter for trespassing into his domain. Fortunately, the soul of the same assassin Blade that had taken out in the beginning of the story, Draven, leapt into action and defeated Abrath. From there, Blade and Draven decided to team up. They escaped OG Hell together and went back to Hellstorm, who then informed them that they could draw out Adonna by destroying an artifact called the Archives of the Second World. It worked too, as Adonna and her minions set themselves upon our heroes after Blade wrecked the Archives. The saga reached its climax when Blade and his crew managed to take back Lightbringer from Adonna and use it to destroy her physical form. Sure, Adonna was successfully defeated, but the damage had been done. Monstrosities were unleashed throughout the world, and Blade had pretty much become the one thing he hated, a full-fledged vampire. Still, Blade was determined to right the wrongs he had caused from this whole thing, so it was business as usual for the iconic Fangslayer. Blade's next outing was almost as troublesome as his previous dance with Adonna. This time, the vampire lord Varna made his return and managed to possess Blade's body. As a result, Blade became a backseat passenger in his own form. As for Varna, well, this guy had the same goal as he did before, to make vampires the apex species on Earth. So while in possession of Blade's body, Varna made sure to take out any potential threats to his plans. He did this by taking out scores upon scores of vampire hunters that Blade personally mentored in the past. Things eventually got so bad that Varna was able to successfully mount his plan on a vampire invasion on the world. He managed to defeat several heroes along the way and even kidnap Brielle, Blade's daughter, who had since become a powerful vampire slayer in her own right. And if that wasn't bad enough, Varna even managed to turn himself into a bona fide god with the help of the Dark Force. However, things finally went our hero's way when champions like Brielle, Spider-Man, Miles Morales, Moon Knight, the Avengers, and even Dracula abandoned himself together to face the dreaded vampire lord. Ultimately, they were able to fend off Varna and free Blade from his grasp. And the last time we see the legendary vampire hunter Blade, he had decided to take some time off to do some soul searching in Thailand.